Before strategy, before tactics, before organized command, war was chaos. Men charged, shouted, and fought as individuals. Strength mattered more than structure. Then ancient Greece changed everything. Instead of warriors fighting alone, Greek city-states introduced something revolutionary: the phalanx. A formation so disciplined, so unified, that it turned ordinary soldiers into an unstoppable wall. Each man carried a heavy shield, locked tightly with the soldier beside him. Long spears pointed forward in rows, creating a moving barrier of bronze and iron. No gaps, no heroes, no individual glory. Victory no longer depended on the strongest fighter. It depended on the strength of the formation. Sparta perfected this system. Their soldiers trained for years to move as one body, step, push, strike, together. If one man broke formation, the entire line could collapse. So discipline became more important than bravery. Battles transformed from scattered duels into calculated collisions. Two phalanxes meeting wasn't just combat, it was pressure against pressure, endurance against endurance. This strategy proved devastatingly effective. Persian forces, often larger and more diverse, struggled against the unified Greek wall. Because the phalanx didn't rely on numbers, it relied on coordination. For the first time in history, warfare became about structure, planning, and collective strength. Armies stopped being mobs and started becoming machines. The phalanx dominated Mediterranean battlefields for centuries, and more importantly, it introduced a new truth that would shape every future military power. Wars are not won by individuals. They are won by systems, discipline, and men willing to fight as one. The Greek phalanx was powerful, but it had a weakness. It was rigid. It fought best on flat, open ground. Break the formation, and its strength disappeared. The Romans saw this flaw and turned it into an opportunity. Instead of one solid wall of soldiers, Rome created something far more advanced: the legion, a fighting force built not on rigidity, but on flexibility. Roman legions were divided into smaller units called maniples. Each unit could move independently, rotate, retreat, or reinforce weak points. Commanders could adapt in real time, changing formations mid-battle. This meant Roman armies could fight anywhere: hills, forests, rough terrain, narrow passes. Where the phalanx struggled, the legion thrived. But the real Roman advantage wasn't just tactics, it was systems. Soldiers trained relentlessly. Engineers built roads, bridges, and siege machines. Supply lines ensured armies stayed fed and equipped. Every campaign was planned like a machine operation. War was no longer just about fighting. It became about organization, logistics, and endurance. At battles like Cannae and Zama, Rome faced enemies who were stronger, faster, and sometimes more experienced. Yet Roman discipline and adaptability kept them in the fight, learning, evolving, returning. Over time, the legion became the most effective military structure the ancient world had ever seen. It allowed Rome to conquer not just territories, but entire civilizations. Because Rome understood something revolutionary: the army that wins is not the strongest, it's the one that adapts, reorganizes, and refuses to break. And with that strategy, Rome didn't just win wars, it built an empire that lasted for centuries. For centuries, powerful empires believed victory came from decisive battles. Two armies meet. One wins, one falls. But what happens when your enemy refuses to stand and fight? Guerrilla warfare changed everything. Instead of facing stronger armies head-on, smaller forces began fighting differently. They attacked supply lines, they ambushed isolated units, they struck at night and vanished by morning. This wasn't war of strength, it was war of patience. One of the clearest examples came during the Peninsular War in the early 1800s, when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, expected quick victory. His armies had crushed most of Europe in open battle, but Spanish fighters refused to give him what he wanted. They sabotaged roads, destroyed communication lines, they attacked small detachments and disappeared into mountains and villages. The word guerrilla itself comes from Spanish, meaning little war. And this little war slowly bled one of the greatest military forces in history. French troops were constantly exhausted. They couldn't secure territory, they couldn't rest safely, and they couldn't force a final, decisive battle. Guerrilla strategy proved something revolutionary. You don't have to defeat an empire's army. You just have to make occupation impossible. This approach would later shape conflicts across the world, from resistance movements in World War II to revolutionary wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It exposed a harsh truth of modern warfare. A powerful army can win every battle and still lose the war. Because sometimes victory doesn't belong to the strongest force, it belongs to the one that controls time, terrain, the enemy's exhaustion. In the 13th century, a storm rose from the steppes of Central Asia. It did not build walls, it did not wait behind fortresses, it moved. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol army transformed warfare into something the world had never seen before: speed as a weapon. Most medieval armies marched slowly. Supply wagons dragged behind them. Knights in heavy armor fought in tight formations. The Mongols were different. Every warrior was a mounted archer. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed. Each soldier traveled with multiple horses, allowing entire armies to move hundreds of kilometers in days. But speed alone wasn't their greatest weapon. It was deception. They mastered the art of the feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic, luring enemies into pursuit, then suddenly turning back in coordinated attack. Armies that believed they were winning suddenly found themselves surrounded. Communication was another advantage. Through a relay system of riders, orders traveled across vast distances, faster than any empire had ever managed before. And then there was psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely. Stories of Mongol brutality spread ahead of the army, causing many places to surrender without a fight. Fear became a strategic tool. In just a few decades, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. They defeated heavily armored knights, fortified cities, and powerful dynasties, not because they had stronger weapons, but because they moved faster, thought smarter, and struck before their enemies could react. The Mongols proved a new reality of warfare. Speed breaks structure, surprise breaks morale, and mobility can conquer empires. For centuries, warfare was dominated by muscle, metal, and courage. Knights in heavy armor ruled battlefields. Castles stood as symbols of power and protection. Then gunpowder arrived, and everything changed. What began in China as an invention for fireworks slowly became the most disruptive military force in history. Cannons appeared first, massive, loud, and terrifying. Walls that once stood for centuries could now collapse in hours. Castles, once the backbone of defense, were suddenly vulnerable. Nobles who relied on fortifications lost their greatest advantage. Then came muskets. They were slow, inaccurate, and clumsy at first. But they had one terrifying advantage. They could kill a trained knight in armor from a distance. Skill with a sword, years of training, noble status, none of it mattered against gunpowder. Battlefields transformed. Armies shifted from individual combat to coordinated firing lines. Strategy focused on range, timing, and volleys of fire. Sieges became artillery duels instead of long starvation tactics, and power itself began to shift. Kings and centralized states started controlling gun production. Armies became larger, more standardized, and more dependent on resources and industry. War was no longer about heroic warriors. It became about firepower, production, and technological advantage. The gunpowder revolution didn't just change how battles were fought, it changed who held power. Knights faded, castles fell, and modern states began rising, armed not with swords, but with smoke, steel, and explosive force. From this moment forward, warfare would be driven not by tradition, but by innovation. For most of history, power was measured in land. Armies marched, borders expanded, empires rose through conquest on the battlefield. But in the age of sail, a new realization emerged. Whoever controls the sea controls everything. No nation understood this better than United Kingdom. Instead of focusing only on continental wars, Britain invested heavily in its navy. Warships protected trade routes, blockaded enemy ports, and projected power across oceans. Naval strategy wasn't just about winning sea battles, it was about strangling your enemy economically. Blockades could starve a nation of resources without a single soldier crossing its borders. Trade ships became strategic lifelines. Colonies became supply bases. The sea turned into a global highway, and whoever ruled it could move troops, goods, and influence anywhere. A defining moment came at the Battle of Trafalgar. When Horatio Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets, it shattered Napoleon Bonaparte's hopes of invading Britain. That single naval victory ensured British dominance for more than a century, and that dominance reshaped the world. Empires became global, wars became intercontinental, economic warfare became as important as military confrontation. Naval supremacy proved something revolutionary. You don't have to conquer land to defeat a nation. You can isolate it. You can block its supplies. You can control the flow of trade and power. From that moment on, great powers weren't just land empires, they were maritime empires, and the oceans became the true battlefield of global dominance. Before the 20th century, wars were mostly fought by armies. Civilians watched from a distance. Economies continued running. Society survived while soldiers fought at the front. Then came a new kind of conflict, total war. It emerged fully during World War I and reached its peak in World War II. For the first time in history, entire nations became part of the battlefield. Factories didn't just produce goods, they produced weapons. Farmers didn't just grow food, they fed armies. Scientists designed new technologies for destruction. Governments controlled industry, resources, and information. Even civilians became targets. Cities were bombed. Infrastructure was destroyed. Propaganda shaped public opinion and morale. War was no longer limited to soldiers at the front. It was fought in factories, in homes, in economies, in the minds of people. Victory depended not just on military skill, but on which nation could produce more, endure longer, and mobilize faster. Countries that adapted their entire society for war gained a massive advantage. The United States, for example, transformed its industrial power into a war machine, producing ships, tanks, aircraft, and supplies at an unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, nations unable to sustain production began collapsing from within. Total war revealed a terrifying reality. Modern wars are not just fought by armies, they are fought by nations. The strongest country isn't always the one with the best soldiers. It's the one with the strongest economy, the most resilient population, and the ability to turn every resource into power. From that moment on, warfare would never again be confined to battlefields. Because in the modern age, when war begins, the entire nation fights. After the trench horror of World War I, military leaders expected the next war to look the same: slow, defensive, and exhausting. Germany thought differently. Instead of fighting a long war of attrition, they developed a strategy built on one principle: end the war before the enemy can react. It was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The idea was simple, but devastating. Strike fast, strike hard, break the enemy's command before they understand what's happening. German forces combined tanks, aircraft, motorized infantry, and radio communication into one coordinated assault. Tanks smashed through weak points in the front line. Aircraft destroyed supply routes and communication centers. Infantry followed quickly to secure the advance. Everything moved at once. Everything hit at once. Defensive lines didn't collapse slowly. They shattered instantly. The world saw this strategy in action when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, then again in France in 1940. Armies that expected months of fighting were defeated in weeks. Blitzkrieg didn't aim to destroy every soldier, it aimed to destroy organization. Once communication failed, once command structures broke, entire armies stopped functioning. Even if they still had troops and weapons, speed became psychological warfare. Confusion spread. Morale collapsed. Resistance weakened before full battles even began. Blitzkrieg redefined modern warfare. Victory no longer depended on slow advances and prolonged sieges. It depended on coordination, communication, and overwhelming force delivered at the perfect moment. And it proved a chilling lesson. In modern war, the fastest army doesn't just win, it prevents the enemy from fighting back at all.